Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, to misquote Benjamin Franklin, nothing can be said to be certain in life except death, taxes and a Brexit bill making its way through Parliament. That really is misquoting him. And this week is no exception, I should say, not perception. Now, this afternoon, MPs will continue debating the EU Withdrawal Bill, with their first opportunity for them to vote taking place after midnight tonight. They'll also vote on the timetable of the bill, a so-called programme motion, which allows for 8 days of debate at committee stage. Tomorrow, the House is expected to discuss a motion from the Leader of the Commons, Andrea Leadsom, which would give the government a majority on the committees that scrutinise government-proposed legislation. And Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn will address the Trades Union Congress conference in Brighton tomorrow afternoon. Then Wednesday will see the last PMQs before the Commons breaks for party conference season. Well, we're joined now from College Green by Emily Ashton from BuzzFeed and The Spectator's Isabel Hardman. Well done, and it stopped raining. It looks like it. Good. Emily, the vote on the second reading is going to be after midnight, so we'll be back to the good old or the bad old days with coffees lined up for those late sittings.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Or a glass of wine for some, I don't know. But yeah, so you'll see votes after midnight. We'll get 3 votes. We've got a Labour reasoned amendment to that second reading motion. Then we've got the second reading motion itself, and then we've got the programme motion. So we've got those 3 votes. So it's taking us to 12:45, and then you get those final votes. So yes, a long day and night ahead.
Right, and the bill is likely to pass, Isabel Hardman, despite Labour's opposition to it. Is that in part because there will be a number of Labour MPs who will defy their own 3-line whip to vote against it? In other words, they'll vote for it.
I think there will be a group of Labour Brexiteers who will want to vote for the bill, but also the Tory Brexit sceptics seem to be focusing their fire really on the committee stage. And the committee stage is going to be much bigger than the second reading, partly because it's committee of the whole House rather than a small committee in another room in the palace. There's much more attention, much more opportunities for anyone to table amendments. And this is where the Tories have long focused their energy. They think it's a more constructive way of fighting some of the government's proposals on Brexit.
Right. I mean, there will be, Emily, 8 days for amendments and the discussion that Isabel was just talking about before it comes back to the Commons for third reading, if that's where some of the Tory remaining MPs are going to sort of target their fire. Will things change dramatically, do you think, in that period of time? Will the government have to give ground?
I think it's inevitable that some ground will have to be given in those 8 days. We've got, 64 hours really in which to make all these kind of big changes. I mean, this is a big bill, just as the government have been saying themselves, and this is why people are angry that they're not actually getting more than 8 days to make these amendments. You're not just overturning the 1972 European Communities Act, but you're converting all these EU laws into domestic laws. It's a huge task, and 8 days doesn't seem quite enough for a lot of people. Well,
and in fact, during the Maastricht Bill, I think they had sort of 22 or maybe 23 days to go through and scrutinise all the legislation. There is another change that is vexing Labour MPs, or opposition MPs in general, and this is about, although it sounds quite technical, changing the makeup of the bill committees that are used to scrutinise the legislation. Now, this is an attempt, Labour say, for a power grab by the government to propose that the government should have a majority on those bill committees. Is this part of a strategy for a smoother Brexit or a power grab?
Well, I think it's an overall power grab. It's not just about Brexit, it's about the government being able to get its legislation through the Commons without anyone really noticing. It's quite exciting for parliamentary geeks like us that people are actually talking about secondary legislation and about bill committees, because they're normally completely neglected in Westminster. And I understand that any minister who wants to do something interesting policy-wise has been told that if they can do it using secondary legislation, they should just go ahead with it, because the government wants to ram as much as possible through the House using secondary legislation. And the debate on Brexit and the debate on this motion that Andrea Leadsom has put forward is really about what's significant and what isn't. We've asked the Prime Minister's spokesman about this. We said, how are you actually going to define what significant is? And he just said significant is something that appears in primary legislation. Now that can be, one man's significant can be another man's massive tax credit cut, like the tax credit cut that George Osborne tried to put through on secondary legislation. So it's a real grey area, and it's quite nice that MPs are sort of waking up to it as a problem, regardless of the issues over a minority government.
Right. I mean, Emily, the government would argue that if they didn't make this change to bill committees, that the bill would end up being held up, that there could be hundreds and hundreds of amendments made, and it would be stuck and thwarted at this particular moment in the bill's passage through Parliament.
Yeah, they're worried that the opposition MPs will make amendments, and those amendments will have to go back to the House of Commons chamber properly, and that will have to be debated, and then they'll have to go back. And yes, it will slow down the whole process. And obviously, we've got a timetable here for the Brexit negotiations, and they just want to get this done. But the problem is that the government had this. The Tories had this disastrous general election. I mean, they failed to win a majority, and this is what people are nervous about, that they're actually grabbing back power after this disastrous election through these other means.
Thank you both very much. Kwasi Kwarteng, this is a power grab. It shows the government's weakness, that in fact it's found itself compelled to actually, as Labour would say, rig committees so that you have a majority on all of them.
I don't think anything is being rigged. I think what's happening is
Well, why make the change?
Well, actually, I mean, if people know anything about the history of secondary legislation, they'll know two things. One, that the Labour government introduced them in 1945 to nationalise vast tracts of the British industry, and they realised...
But we're in 2017
I know
with the
that,
Brexit
but it's important that your viewers understand where we're coming from. And also in 1974, when there was a minority government led by Labour, they did exactly the same thing, because they realised that if they didn't have a majority on secondary bill legislation committees, nothing would get done. And the problem is that these committees have very few numbers of people, maybe 9, maybe 11 people. And so you're either going to have the government in a permanent minority, or the government being able to have a majority.
Right,
and of course,
but the rules
if the government's
are that these committees are composed of a make-up as a result of an election.
That's true, but if you take example, if you have a committee, no, but if you have a committee of 9, you either have 4 with the government or 5. There's no other way you can subdivide it. So if it's 4, that doesn't reflect the strength of the government, and if it's 5, we're in a majority. So it's one or the other. And actually, in terms of the good governance of this country, you need a government to have a majority on those bill committees.
Do you accept, Annalise, that unless this change happens, then this bill, which is perhaps what Labour wants, will be held up indefinitely?
No, I don't. And I actually think that this power grab is going well beyond any matters that might need to be dealt with expeditiously because of the Brexit timetable. I mean, we both saw last week, we're both in the Ways and Means resolutions, part of the finance bill, a decision around whether or not to tax redundancy payments. Now, it looks like it's going to be going through in secondary legislation. Sure. Why? Why is it not going to be in front of Parliament? It's not just one case around these Brexit issues. We're finding this cropping up time and time again with this government, and we need to have a proper debate. People said they voted to leave, some of them. Obviously, I've talked to a lot of my constituents who did, because they wanted to have more power in the British Parliament. And yet we see actually the opposite happening here, a government that's frightened to have its positions criticised.
So the precedent I mentioned was the Labour government, minority government in 1974. And that's exactly what they did, and they were right to do that. It's not a different context.
Can we move on to today,
It's about the domestic agenda,
right? But
and it's about the government being able to get a mandate for its domestic agenda.
And is this because you feel you don't have a strong enough mandate, and that you're worried that Brexit is losing ground in Parliament?
I don't think, as one of your commentators said, I don't think it's all about Brexit. It's about the government's broader agenda.
But this is why the government has been compelled to do it.
And as I pointed out, if you have a committee of 9 people and you have the government having 4, that does not reflect our strength, the Conservative Party's strength in the House of Commons. 4 is too few a number. But you can't subdivide MPs into lots of little bits. So you either have 4 members or 5.
We've understood.
That's
understood
but it's really important.
Equally divide 9 into 4.5 people.
So what you're suggesting is that the government should be permanently underrepresented in these smaller committees.
Not permanently, but you are obviously doing the converse, which is actually making sure you've got a majority on all of them. I mean, who is winning the Brexit row and battle now within the Conservative Party? Are they Conservatives on the side of the argument who signed a letter arguing that any Brexit transition period should not mean staying in the EU by stealth, or those who want assurances that if they are to back the bill at the 3rd reading, this power grab shouldn't go
I think
ahead.
one of the things that's come out in your programme is the fact that the government is actually quite united on this second reading. I mean, your commentators were saying that the second reading, we're hoping, that will pass the House. And that shows, in fact, that the Conservative MPs are quite united on
that, but not obviously through the scrutinising stage.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, your guess is as good as mine on that.
Annalise, Caroline Flint, Labour MP, former Europe Minister, has said that she will defy the Labour whip and abstain on today's vote, while Graham Stringer, another MP, said voting against was a breach of trust. Whose side are you on?
Well, I respect both those people very much, but I don't agree with them. I actually think, and from many of my conversations with Leave voters, as well as with the Remain voters, of course the Leave voters had their side better represented in the vote, those people don't agree with the way that the government is pushing through Brexit.
No, but I'm asking
and
you,
because of that, they don't agree with this withdrawal bill. This is not about whether you respect the result of the referendum or not, and that's why I think that
you think Caroline Flint is wrong?
I think Caroline and Graham have got it wrong. This withdrawal bill and the way the government is going ahead with Brexit is not respecting the results of that referendum. This weekend I was out on the doorstep talking to people, different parts of my constituency, and the one thing people kept mentioning was, and that included people who'd voted to leave, they didn't like this power grab we've just been talking about. And the vote tonight is about whether we accept the approach of the government, not whether we accept the result of the referendum.
Well, OK. Well, you were an MEP,
yes.
And you campaigned to remain, like many of your colleagues. Is it now really the time for people like you to have the courage of your convictions and be proud to be a Remainer, rather than hanging your opposition on technicalities to do with the makeup of public bill committees? Because actually you failed to have the courage of those convictions in the past few months, just as Tony Blair was arguing yesterday.
Right.
No, because I'm a Democrat. So when I campaigned in that referendum, I was saying to people this is going to be an important vote and it's going to shape politics for the next 25 years, probably more, and how you vote matters and will be bound by the result of that referendum. I regret the result, of course I do, but I know that one side won.
So why are you opposing this bill on technicalities then?
Not on technicalities,
it's
not, with respect, it's not on technicalities. It's much, much more than that. We've had a shambolic approach from this government. We've been selling our country down the river. I know about this because I'm talking to business people, people on the EU side. They can't believe the disorganisation that we've had. And as this is occurring, we're losing British jobs. We're losing so many of the things that make our country great because we're not actually putting our best foot forward.
Right.
And tonight is an opportunity for us to say, yes, we respect the result of the referendum, but not Brexit in this way. Not an undemocratic Brexit that loses us jobs.
I'll let you respond and then we'll go back to Tony Blair yesterday.
Well, I was going to mention Tony Blair. At least he has the honesty and courage of his convictions.
So, I'm sorry, are you saying that I'm dishonest?
He wants to stay in. I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying there's a lot of sort of funny business going on. Lots of people are saying they respect the result of the EU. I'm not saying of the referendum, but they also secretly want to stay in the EU. We know that. At least Tony Blair has had the honesty and the openness to say he wants to reverse the result. And this is how. And he's actually urged MPs and ministers to vote against the bill because he doesn't want to leave the EU.
Well, look, he gave his analysis, as you both know, of the risks of Brexit as he sees them, followed by what he called the risks of a Jeremy Corbyn government. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
And the risk is, actually, that we have a Brexit followed by, I'm afraid, an unreconstructed leftist programme from Labour. And if you combine those two things together, in my view, we will be in a very serious situation as a country. And therefore, this is why this is not just about Brexit, by the way. It's about how does the centre ground of British politics recover its traction and show that there is a change that we can make to our country that really deals with its problems and doesn't go down the false path of either old-fashioned programmes of left or right.
Are his interventions helpful, Annalise?
Well, I don't agree, obviously, with what he said there. Actually, the Labour manifesto, I think, was pretty middle of the road in terms of turning our country towards the path that those successful countries economically and socially have been taking. He's got the right to speak. I'm never going to try and stop anyone from debating and discussing, but I personally don't agree with him on this one. I think that Labour manifesto was supported by huge swathes of people, and it's something that we're going to keep fighting to try and get introduced because, you know, big challenges, social care, NHS, etc., aren't going to be dealt with otherwise.
Let's leave it there.
MPs are set for a long night. The vote on the bill that will transfer all EU laws into British law and pave the way for Brexit is not till midnight. Downing Street says it's confident that the vote will go the government's way. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, is in Westminster for us. Laura, Labour's already said it will vote against this. How does that affect the arithmetic?
Well, despite that, George, as long as all government MPs turn up and as long as all government MPs do what they are told, they are relatively confident that they will get this bill at this stage through tonight. And there's been all sorts of efforts to get people here. 2 MPs even brought their baby to work today to make sure that they are here for this vital vote tonight. Ministers say it's so important, it must pass, to make sure that the day after we leave the EU, there is a law of the land. Because, of course, right now, thousands of pages of our law come from the European Union, and they have to be transposed onto the British statute books for simply there to be anything there in place in 2019. The much more controversial part is that ministers also want to give themselves extra authority to change those laws at a future date. And it's that has got the Labour Party, some Tories, the Lib Dems and the SNP really having their neck up about this. They do not like that suggestion. They think that ministers are trying to grab power and they'd be able to behave on a whim without consulting MPs. But at this stage, this first vote on this huge bill, it looks like the fragile government arithmetic will hold. That's because Tory rebels are keeping their powder dry for many more occasions through the coming months. And also there are also some Labour MPs who are worried that if they vote against, they could look like they are somehow trying to Brexit, trying to go against the decision of the people. So tonight, the government does look like they will get their way. But there'll be plenty more occasions where MPs will be making them sweat it out till the early hours.
Laura, thank you very much.
Now, MPs will be staying up into the early hours tonight for a crucial vote on the Brexit Withdrawal Bill designed to turn European rules and regulations into British laws. Jeremy Corbyn has urged all Labour MPs to vote the measure down, calling it an unprecedented power grab by the government, whilst ministers insist defeat would mean a chaotic exit from the EU. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this report.
Opposition, do your job. A tiny cluster of protesters shouted outside Parliament. The Labour leadership is ordering its MPs to oppose the bill, pasting EU law into UK law, but some believe that risks alienating those, including Labour supporters, who backed Brexit.
I think in the Labour Party there are some people post the general election who think there might be a chance of bringing down the government having another general election. I'm not
Some
really
people probably
convinced.
means the leader in his office.
I'm not convinced that's on the card. I think there are others who actually are Remainers who really do want to turn about the vote that we had in 2016, and they'd like us to stop us leaving the European Union.
So after much talk of Tory dissent, it'll be Labour MPs who split tonight. Some of them fearful that their leadership is trying to soften the party line on Brexit to woo those who backed Remain. Today, Jeremy Corbyn added to their unease when he said staying in the single market forever was open for discussion.
But just for the sake of clarity, that could mean staying in the single market indefinitely.
We want a relationship which allows us to trade within the single market, whether that's formal membership, which is only possible, I believe, if you're actually a member of the EU, or whether it's an agreed trading relationship, is open for discussion.
The leader's office said party policy had not changed. Plenty of Labour MPs did attack the bill in the Commons, saying the government had taken powers to change pasted across EU law without proper scrutiny and ignoring the general election setback.
Everybody in this House and those beyond know that she did not get that mandate. She did not get that free hand. This bill is drafted for a reality which no longer exists. And yet the government is continuing as if, to coin a phrase, nothing has changed.
This is the new in-fashion statement from the SNP, power grab. Can you name me one power that the UK government will grab back from Holyrood?
On fishing, on agriculture, on energy. We were told that these powers would come back to the Scottish Parliament without touching the sides.
Several Conservative MPs said they would vote for changes to the bill later in the process, but sometime after midnight tonight, it'll pass its first big hurdle.
Well, the Labour leadership did not want the top of the story tonight to be a Labour rebellion, but thanks to the fact that unless someone pops out of the woodwork, there are no Tory rebels, that's what it looks like at the moment, that is going to be the top of the story. And they worry how that will go down in Brexit supporting areas. So the government, at the end of the day, will get this bill through its second reading. But that doesn't mean it's going to be, in the parlance that they use around here, a clean bill. It won't go all the way through Parliament without being amended. Absolutely nobody you can find thinks that is going to happen. But the government didn't feel it wanted to bring forward its amendments today. It's not ready to do that. It doesn't feel it has to because it was going to win the vote anyway. As for that Jeremy Corbyn remark, well, there have been some moments recently in Labour where they've been dancing around with words a little bit, edging the policy in a certain direction. I don't think this was one of those moments. This was Jeremy Corbyn, as one shadow cabinet member put it to me, not necessarily policing his language like some of us do.
Intriguing. Thank you, Gary. Well, back now to Brexit, and the government's negotiating strategy has also been under attack from the Trade Union Congress boss, Frances O'Grady. She told her delegates at the conference in Brighton that the repeal bill would mean open season on workers' rights if it's allowed to go through the Commons unamended. Our political correspondent Michael Crick is there. Michael.
Well, as Gary Gibbon was making it clear earlier, the Labour Party position on Brexit and what happens vis-à-vis the single market is rather confusing, if not confused, right now. Well, certainly a lot clearer is the trade union position. And Frances O'Grady, the TUC General Secretary, made it plain that in her view, trade union members will be a lot better off if Britain remains both within the single market and within the customs union.
So the TUC and unions, we've set out our clear tests for Brexit. That's the shape of the best Brexit deal. That's the Brexit deal that working people need. Staying in the single market and customs union would deliver it, but if there's a better way to deliver the deal, then we're listening.
Well, tomorrow afternoon, Jeremy Corbyn will be coming down here to the TUC and making a big speech in which he's likely to make one of the strongest statements heard in many decades from a Labour Party leader in favour of trade unionism and belonging to trade unions. It may be called the Labour Party, but in the past, Labour leaders have often been reluctant, for instance, to back unions in industrial disputes. Not Corbyn. Last week, of course, he backed the McDonald's workers who are on strike over low pay. And Mr Corbyn may be facing something of a rebellion at Westminster tonight, but some good news for him in that two of his supporters decisively won an important election for membership of a rather obscure but very powerful committee within the party that looks after the Labour Party conference. In a couple of weeks' time, he'll be here with his conference, hoping to increase his own grip and that of his supporters on the party.
Michael Crick, and we're joined now from the Commons by the Labour MP and Chair of the Brexit Committee, Hilary Benn. Mr Benn, it still seems a very confusing picture, quite what Labour's position is, with Mr Corbyn somehow conceiving that you can stay in the single market and not be in the European Union.
Well, I don't accept that, John, because Keir Starmer set out on behalf of the whole of the Shadow Cabinet a few weeks ago our position in respect of what will now inevitably be the transitional arrangements that we're going to have if we want to avoid the UK economy falling off the edge of a cliff, that we stay in a customs union and the single market for the period of those transitional arrangements, and what follows from that will depend on the nature of the final status negotiations that everybody except the British government now recognises cannot be completed in the time that is available between now and October of next year. There's simply too many things to discuss, and if the government's going to achieve its objective, which is to say to British business, we only want you have to make one lot of changes, then at the end of March 2019, things are going to have to stay the same, and therefore they're going to have to adopt the position that Keir Starmer has set out very clearly on behalf of the Labour Party.
But then you find divisions on the other end of the party, with Caroline Flint saying today that you can't possibly vote against this bill because that would be to reject the democratic rights of the people who voted in the referendum.
Well, I don't agree, because we made it very clear in our election manifesto we accept the outcome of the referendum. I voted, the majority of Labour MPs voted for the Article 50 legislation, because that is what started us on the process of leaving the EU. 2 years will run out and we will have left the institutions by the end of March 2019. And I'd also point out, John, that David Davis himself said last Thursday, this bill is not about whether we are leaving the European Union, because we are. It's about how we get our law into shape. The problem with the bill is it proposes to take such extraordinarily wide and sweeping powers using secondary legislation, including, incredibly, the power to amend this bill once it becomes an act. And that is why I think it's perfectly right and proper for the Labour opposition to say tonight, look, we accept there needs to be a bill to give effect to this, but I'm afraid this bill doesn't do it, and the government has got to go away and think again.
And very briefly, bad news, it would have thought, one would think, for certainly people like you. You've got people that are now on the arrangements committee of the party conference who absolutely are part of Momentum and anti-you, personally.
The outcome of democratic elections in the Labour Party, John, can never be bad news. They are what the members have democratically decided.
Well,
and we all respect that.
philosophical point, let's leave it at that. Thank you very much indeed, Henry Benn, for joining us. Thank you.
The effects of Hurricane Irma back home now, and famous last words, but it looks tonight that despite all the concerns of the Labour Party about extra powers for ministers in the European Union withdrawal bill, the government will get the bill through later tonight. There are almost 2 more hours of debate before MPs vote at around midnight. The result could be interesting, though, for what it tells us about a Labour rebellion more than a Conservative one.
Started on Thursday, it'll be going long into the night tonight.
Stop Brexit!
Outside Parliament, protesters were hoping that the bill transferring EU legislation into British law can be stopped in its tracks. Inside, a rebellion is brewing, but one that's causing as many problems for Labour as the government.
European Union Withdrawal Bill.
Opposition MPs have been instructed to vote against the bill. Not all are prepared to obey.
I cannot vote to block this bill, and I shall be abstaining to allow the bill to be further discussed and amended. We have a job to do to ensure a smooth, orderly Brexit.
Tonight, I will be voting for the only option for the referendum result to be implemented. That was the wish of my constituents, and that was the wish of the country.
These vaults inside the Palace of Westminster contain every Act of Parliament passed since 1497. It's this one, the European Communities Act of 1972, that the bill would repeal. But it's the use of this rather more ancient one, dating from the time of Henry VIII, that's causing all the problems, because it allows the government to make changes without full parliamentary scrutiny.
It's not just Labour MPs, but some Tories who don't like these so-called Henry VIII powers.
There are difficulties around the Henry VIII powers. Clauses 7, clauses 9 go beyond, it seems to me, that which is acceptable or necessary. And I hope the government will approach this in a sensible and constructive spirit.
On the whole, the Tudor exercise was not a proud demonstration of democracy, and these are clauses that Erdogan, Maduro and Putin would be proud of.
Despite those fears, the government is likely to pass its first Brexit test in the early hours tomorrow. Tory detractors are minded to hold their firepower for a later stage, and some Labour MPs will ease the bill's passage. Romilly Weeks, News at 10, Westminster.